Silence, you see, isn't always empty. It's one of those tricky things, like fog that moves when you try to walk through it. It feels like absence, but it's really just presence with the volume turned all the way down, especially when it comes from someone avoidant. That particular kind of silence isn't a blank page. It's a tightly folded letter they're too afraid to hand you, which brings us, inevitably, curiously, to our story today: how to reignite an avoidance interest after silence. And if you've landed here, I imagine you're sitting with a few unanswered texts, a string of seen messages with no reply, or perhaps just an unsettling quiet where warmth once lived. It started off well, didn't it? Their interest, their charm, their subtle but unmistakable signs that you mattered. And then, nothing. A vanishing act, but done so softly you almost convinced yourself they hadn't left. Just a delay, you told yourself. Just space. But that space has turned into days, maybe weeks, maybe even longer. So now you wonder, is it over? Or more haunting still, is it unfinished? You see, avoidants have this peculiar habit of leaving stories mid-sentence, just as you're leaning in, just as it's getting good, just when you begin to believe in the softness blooming between you. They retreat, politely, quietly, with plausible excuses. They'll say things like, "I've been busy," or "I just needed time." But what they mean, if you could see behind the curtain, is, "I felt something, and that something scared me." Avoidants fear the very thing they crave: closeness. Not because they're broken, but because closeness, to them, has often meant surrender, exposure, risk. Many of them grew up learning that love comes with conditions, that intimacy demands a cost they're not sure they can afford. So when someone like you starts to get through the cracks, when you start seeing the real them, the tender, imperfect, gloriously complicated them, they pull the plug. Not because you did something wrong, but because their nervous system whispers, "This is dangerous. Run." So they go silent, and now here you are, wondering if it's possible to light a fire again in someone who's already stepped into the cold. The answer is yes, but not the way you think. Let me tell you about Marlin, a Swede, stoic to the bone, an artist who painted in shades of grey, literally and emotionally. She met Luca, a sound engineer from Belgrade, who had the kind of voice that felt like a late-night train ride. At first, everything was easy, light, curious. They'd walk for hours without agenda, speak in silences more than words. Then one day, just as Luca confessed something real, something about his father's death, and how it left a hole in his chest he never quite patched, Marlin vanished. Not literally, but she cancelled the next few meetups. Her replies turned from paragraphs to fragments. She stopped sharing. Luca, understandably, panicked. He sent messages, tried humor, then honesty, then finally silence of his own. Weeks passed. Now here's what Luca did differently, and why it worked. He didn't chase, he didn't plead, he pivoted. You see, the key to reigniting an avoidance interest isn't pressure, it's presence, but with space. Warmth, but without demand. A gentle invitation, rather than a knock at the door. Luca posted a photo one afternoon, not of a sunset or some moody quote, but of an old cassette tape. A mixtape, in fact. He captioned it, "Found this in a drawer." Funny how sound remembers what we forget. That was it. Marlin saw it, didn't reply. 3 days later she messaged, "What was on it?" Now, I know what you're thinking. A cassette. That's the trick. Of course not. It wasn't the object, it was the gesture. You see, avoidants don't respond to pursuit. They respond to resonance. When you remind them of what felt safe, warm and unforced. You stir the part of them that wants to come back, but is too scared to feel chased or trapped. To reignite an avoidance interest, you must become something rare, a source of familiarity without pressure, nostalgia without guilt, curiosity without confrontation. Most people, when faced with avoidant silence, take one of three paths. They panic and chase, sending longer messages, asking questions like, "What happened? Are you mad? Did I do something wrong?" Or they mirror the silence, but with resentment, going cold, cutting off, trying to teach them a lesson. Or worst of all, they become a performance, trying to win them back by becoming more desirable, more aloof, more whatever the internet says will work. But here's what almost nobody tries: being genuine, consistent, and emotionally self-possessed. Let me give you another story. A woman named Syra, Greek, a documentary filmmaker, once told me about a man she dated named Tomaz. He was older, soft-spoken, moved like he was always listening to music only he could hear. He disappeared after their third date. No explanation, just gone. Weeks later, she sent him a voice note, just 15 seconds. She said, "Hey, I saw someone eating halva on the train today. Reminded me of how you said it tastes like sand and honey. That made me laugh. Hope you're all right." And she didn't follow up. She didn't ask for a reply. She simply left a breadcrumb. That breadcrumb did something remarkable. It told him, "You matter. I remember you, but I'm not going to demand anything." 10 days later, he replied, apologetically, cautiously, and slowly, they started again. Because when avoidants feel safe enough to return without facing a tribunal, they're far more likely to tiptoe back into connection. You must understand this. The silence of an avoidant is not always rejection. Often, it's regulation. They're not ignoring you. They're managing the tidal wave of emotion they're not sure how to handle. They're afraid they'll lose themselves if they get too close. Or worse, lose you if you see them too clearly. And the moment you push too hard, even from a place of sincerity, it confirms their fear that love equals pressure. But when you offer connection without requiring control, something ancient and sacred happens. They begin to trust. Trust, for an avoidant, is not built through intensity. It's built through consistency. So what does that look like in practice? It looks like this. You don't send a dozen messages. You send one. Something kind, personal, free of emotional charge. You don't say, "Why haven't you replied?" You say, "Thought of you when I passed that little cafe you liked." Then you let it go. You don't post cryptic quotes about heartbreak. You post about your life, your joy, your wholeness, not as a performance, but as proof. You are not frozen. You are not waiting in purgatory. You are living. Avoidants are drawn to people who don't orbit them, because orbit feels like pressure. It feels like dependence. It feels like danger. But someone who stands firmly in their own life, yet leaves the door open, even just a crack, becomes irresistible. Not because they're unattainable, but because they're safe. And I'll tell you this, with as much honesty as I can muster, if the avoidant you cared for does not return, even when faced with warmth, patience, and sincerity, then their silence is not a puzzle to solve. It is a boundary. Respect it. But more often than not, if your connection was genuine, if there was true resonance between you, they will resurface. And when they do, they won't say what you wish they would. They won't confess they missed you with poetic detail. They might not apologize. They might not explain. But they'll send a small signal. "Hey," or "saw this and thought of you," or maybe just an emoji, a safe offering, like a bird landing on your windowsill. Your job then is simple. Don't interrogate, don't punish. Just respond, gently. And if you're still open, if your heart hasn't hardened like cement in the waiting, then engage. Slowly, but wisely. Because the goal isn't just to reignite interest. The goal is to build something real, something resilient, something that doesn't require you to contort yourself just to be loved. One last story. Heikki, a Finnish graphic novelist, once vanished for 3 months after falling hard for a woman named Mira. She was warm, articulate, the kind of woman who remembers birthdays and your favorite mug. Heikki left without a word. 3 months of nothing. She never begged. She lived her life, posted about her dog, her work, her sister's wedding. Then one day, she posted a sketch he'd once doodled on a napkin, captioned, "Still one of my favorite things anyone's ever drawn for me." He liked the post, then messaged. They rebuilt. And today, they're married. Not because she chased him, but because she remembered him with grace. That's your path. Not control, not performance. Grace. Stillness. A soft invitation that says, you're allowed to come back, but only if you do it with care. And if they do, then perhaps that silence wasn't an ending. It was an exhale before a better beginning.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.